The Economic Club of Minnesota's mission is to provide a world-class nonpartisan forum for national and international leaders in business and public policy to discuss ideas that affect how Minnesota can better compete in the global economy. The Economic Club of Minnesota, engaging the world, strengthening Minnesota.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman Kennedy, for that incredibly gracious introduction. This is so Minnesota. I love how you part that we did run against each other at one point, but we're just too nice to mention it here. But you have just been such a good leader, not only of an incredibly successful business career, but now that you've decided to turn that into teaching and inspiring young people to go into politics and into public service, no matter how hard it may seem. Thank you very much, and thank you for your service. I do want to report that Washington did not blow up yesterday, just to make clear. And just one note on that, I truly believe in my heart, my deepest heart, that any president, a Democrat or Republican, which we know at some point we will have again, that they should be able to get their team in. And we spend so much time spinning our wheels on, the undersecretary of undersecretaries. And my hope is that we will now be able to move this along so that we can get done on important things that people in this room believe in, like immigration reform and doing something long-term on the budget, comprehensive tax reform, so that we can at least get a president's team in place. So with that, I want to thank the Economic Club, Steve Sanger and Elliot Jaffe, my friend Tim Penny for all his good work, and all of you. I know the Canadian Council is out there somewhere. You guys need to know that we do a tug of war every year from International Falls to Fort Francis with Canada, and the loser ends up in the Rainy River. Our team has lost, the American team, for 3 years until this year. And the council was nice enough to come over to the American side and give a big, rah-rah of how Canada was going to win again. But what he didn't know is we had gotten 6 former Vikings to come up. And as he was on the stage, they literally mounted the stage and said to me, "He's trash-talking us. He's trash-talking us." And he's not really that tall, and it was almost an international incident. But we did go on to win that race. So I am here today to not talk about everything that's happening in Washington, but to talk about someone who actually can get things done in Washington and get things done in business, and that's my good friend, Tom Nides. Tom and I go way back. We actually met, I can still remember the very first day. We were both sophomores in college, and we were both interns for then Vice President Mondale. And I walked into this office, I can see him today, with his feet on the desk, with this vice president's pin saying, "Vice President's office, Tom Nides on the phone." You would think he was like, the chief of staff, answering the phone call. He had this pizzazz about him. And he was assigned truly like the glamorous things. Like all summer we got to work on keeping the foghorn in Duluth. That might not sound that glamorous, but for an intern, and his main contact in Minnesota was none other than Gino Palucci. And he would call every day, and Tom would say things like, "Oh yes, Mr. Palucci, I just talked to the vice president about the foghorn. We're getting this done." So while Tom is dealing with these things, it's true story, completely true story, and he's there with his feet up on the desk, I am assigned the entire summer to do a furniture inventory of the vice president's office. And this literally meant that I had to crawl under everyone's desk and chair and write down the serial number. And as you know, the vice president is a very honest guy, so nothing was missing. That's my first report. And the second is I always like to tease Tom. While he's done pretty well in life, it turned out pretty well for me, as that was my first job in Washington, and this was my second. From there, we got to be very good friends. And he's the kind of guy that is still, when he had his job in the State Department, which I'll mention later, but literally he's number 2 in the State Department. And one day I was planning a party, and I decided to call him. And it rang a few times, and he answered, and he sounds kind of tired. And I said, "What's wrong with you?" And he said, "Well, I figured it's important." And I go, "Well, where are you?" And he said, "I'm in Afghanistan, and it's 3 in the morning." And he goes, "Why are you calling?" I go, "I'm calling to invite you to brunch." And I said, "Why did you answer the phone?" And this is the good friend Tom Nides, "Because I saw it was you." And that is the kind of friend he is to everyone around him. So here's the Tom Nides story. I'm sure his family would love to supplement this, but I won't let them. Tom grew up in Duluth. His mom was a teacher. His dad was a financial advisor. His family roots were in the clothing business with the Nides Brothers clothing store in Hibbing. He graduated from Duluth East High School in 1979. And by that time, 1979, high school senior, he had already mastered the patented Tom Nides art of persuasion. I don't know what other high school kid would do this, but Tom Nides is a high school student. I was just at my daughter's graduation. They had the math teacher as their keynote speaker for the school. He decided, because two people who were intimately involved with Vice President Mondale had gone to Duluth East, Warren Spaniff knows them, Richard Moe, Mike Berman. He called them up, made connections, and somehow Tom Nides got the Vice President of the United States to speak at his high school graduation. True story. He then graduated from the University of Minnesota with a degree in political science. In addition to our internship together for Vice President Mondale, he went on to hold several high-level positions on Capitol Hill with Speaker Tom Foley, with Representative Tony Coelho, and then he served as Chief of Staff to U.S. Trade Representative Mickey Cantor during the Clinton years. He then went on to manage former Senator Joe Lieberman's vice presidential campaign. During Tom's Senate confirmation hearings later for that State Department job, Lieberman said he was convinced that Tom would hit the ground running with the State Department. In his own words, he said Tom had already managed, quote, another large, complex, and unwieldy bureaucracy. That would be my campaign. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, Tom met and married his very talented and incredibly nice wife, Virginia, now Deputy Bureau Chief for CNN's Washington office. They have two kids, Max and Taylor. So at the end of 2010, Tom was confirmed as the Deputy Secretary of State. This means he was literally the number 2 person in the State Department working with Secretary Clinton, taking the reins from Jack Lew, who's now the Treasury Secretary. His role was to oversee the entire State Department budget, among other things. During his 2 years on the job, he logged countless hours traveling across Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. He played a key role with diplomacy in that region. He was credited with leading the negotiations that ended a 7-month stalemate with Pakistan in 2012. That was after the 2011 NATO airstrike that accidentally killed several Pakistani soldiers, leading Pakistan to close the NATO supply lines along the Afghan border. It was a very tense situation, but Tom successfully navigated the discussions between top U.S. and Pakistani diplomats and got the job done. He's also been a pragmatic friend to business. I can tell you, anyone in the hospitality industry, that when Tom got to the State Department, Senator Blunt and I had worked for years to try to speed up the visas, the tourist visas, to get people to, come to the Mall of America and Radisson hotels and everything else, and all of our tourism in our country, which had been on the decline. I ran after several dinners. My husband can attest to this with the statistics. Literally brought them places, and one day at 7 a.m. he called me and he said, I've looked at this. This is I won't say the word, he said, mess. And he got on the case, and we literally saw change in 6 months. Working with Hubert Joly, who was then at Carlson Company, he greatly increased the number of visas that we're issuing out of China, now out of Brazil, and we've seen some monumental increases in the tourism industry and foreign visitors that spend an average of $5,000 when they come to this country. That's what Tom Nides did in literally 6 months. So now he has rejoined his former firm of Morgan Stanley in the role of managing director and vice chairman. From Capitol Hill to the campaign trail to Wall Street, whether it's brokering diplomatic agreements in the Mideast or convincing a vice president to speak at his high school graduation, Tom has earned a reputation as the rarest of rare in Washington, D.C., someone who gets things done and actually likes doing it. With that, I give you my good friend, Tom Nides. Thank you.
Well, let me just say a couple things. That story is sort of true that Amy said at the beginning, okay? But what is actually quite true There is probably not a more effective United States senator, and I know a lot of United States senators, than my friend Amy Klobuchar. And the reason for it is quite simple. Amy cares deeply about her constituents and cares deeply about the values that she has received growing up in this state. I'll tell you an interesting story. We were at, John and I, and Amy and Virginia were at lunch right in the middle of the shutdown. And my wife is banging on her because she works at, my wife was at CNN, she's trying to get a scoop from Amy, yakking at her about what's going to happen. And all Amy wants to talk about is the medical device industry. I said, Amy, I don't want to hear about the medical device industry. You have no idea, Tom, she says, the jobs that are at stake in my state if we don't fix this medical device issue. So lo and behold, after ruining our lunch, she convinced me that the medical device industry was an important industry and that we need to be doing something. I think most people probably understand that as well. What Amy mentioned is that we both had the honor to work for a guy named Walter Mondale, who, tens of thousands of people just like me and just like Amy got turned on about public service because Fritz Mondale. And he is a true patriot and a great American. And he is also a very good friend. And my pal Warren Spanis is here. I want you to know that the Attorney General is the first campaign I worked on was Warren Spanis' campaign. Unfortunately, we didn't win that campaign either, but nonetheless, we were quite close, and another individual who strikes me as a true Minnesotan. Tim Penny, thank you. Tim and I were colleagues on the Hill. Tim defined at the time what bipartisanship was about. He defined it then, he defines it now, and thank you for your leadership. And Congressman Mark Kennedy is actually the reason I'm here. I was in Hong Kong 2 months ago at a dinner, and he was, by happenstance, showed up at the dinner, and we started talking. I didn't know the congressman, and he said, would you do me a favor, would you might come to Minnesota and speak at the Economic Club? I had a couple of drinks at that point. I was jet lagged, I should say, and I said, sure, I'll come, and I never thought he'd follow through, and here I am at 30-degree weather. It's great. And I just want to also say I've got my brothers here, my sister's here, my sister-in-law's here, my nephew's here, and a bunch of my pals from my fraternity brothers are here from my fraternity at Minnesota. If they start telling you any stories that what I did is wrong, it's very similar to Amy's story, so just don't believe it. I'm going to spend just a couple minutes talking a little bit about kind of my experiences at the State Department and a couple of my observations that I had having worked there. As Amy pointed out, I've been kind of blessed by being able to work in the government and work in business and be able to go back and forth. Some people refer to it as the revolving door. I think that's a little derogatory. I'd like to refer to it as an opportunity to serve and also pay my bills. So I am, and I've seen it all. I mean, I was in the middle of the economic crisis in 2008 and 9, and I had the opportunity to testify on Benghazi in front of the United States Senate. So I've had the opportunity to do both, and certainly I have seen it all. But the most interesting of all the experiences I've had is really the last 2.5+ years working at the State Department, working as Hillary Clinton's deputy. When I first took the job, Secretary Clinton said, I said to her, what's the job? I mean, I'd like to know what I'm going to be responsible for. She said, well, you're going to be responsible for the budget. I said, that's okay, that seems easy. Iraq, the transition from military to civilian in Iraq, and I said, well, that seems a little bit more difficult. Afghanistan and Pakistan, and this thing called economic statecraft. And I didn't realize what she'd actually told me I was going to do until I realized how complicated it all was. But my first observation, I'll just point out with 4 quick observations. The first observation is the State Department is a very cool institution. And I say it's a cool institution because it's really not well understood among the American people. I would suggest to you it is the best ROI, return on investment, that any government agency, regardless of where I've ever worked, is for the American people. With just 1% of the federal budget, 1% of the federal budget, less than $50 billion, the Foreign Service and the Civil Service are staffing over 270 missions around the world. That's everyone from Dubai to Paris and everywhere in between. It provides everything from the aid to Israel to fighting AIDS in Africa with George Bush's PEPFAR program, to pushing GE to sell engines in Brazil, to making the Chinese live up to the commitments they gave us. It's to pushing the rule of law. Because guess what? If you don't have rule of law in these countries, you can't get anything done. But most importantly, the State Department is a partner to the Defense Department. And what I mean by that is I remember sitting with Dave Petraeus in Kabul. In fact, I just met someone who just recently returned from Afghanistan. Is he here? There you are. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry, what's your name? Craig. Thank you very much. And I remember sitting with General Petraeus, and he was saying, "You understand what you guys are about?" I said, "General, tell me what we're about." He says, "Our job is to clear. Our job is to get rid of the Taliban. And your job as diplomats is to hold. You guys got to hold it. We can't be here forever. You guys have got to hold it. That means what you have to do is you have to do things like rule of law. You need to build roads. You need to build civil society. You need to have a sustainable country for which we can be proud of, for the soldiers who have lost their lives and the soldiers who have committed themselves to protect us." So when I had an opportunity to spend time working at the State Department, I realized the State Department is much bigger than just a bunch of diplomats doing visas. But it was really the heart and the bone and the backbone of diplomacy and our national security. It never became clearer to me than working with the Defense Department and working what we were doing in Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan and the places that have individuals and elements that want to do danger to us. The second observation. Someone famous said, his name was Bill Clinton, in 1992, when he was running for president, he had this saying, "It's the economy, stupid." And that was the theme of the campaign in 1992. And let me make a quick observation for you. As you've seen what's happened in the Middle East, I would argue the following premise. It's the economy, stupid. The reality of this, what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in the Arab Spring, is not all about the Sunnis and Shiites and 1,000 years of conflict. It's about the economy. Just think about the statistics. Right now in Egypt, youth unemployment is sitting at 39%. In Egypt, they are graduating 400,000 students a year from college. Guess what? Those students have nowhere to go. In Jordan, the number is 38%. In Libya, it is 30%. In Tunisia, it's 30%. Remember how this revolution started in the Middle East. It started by a fruit vendor who lit himself on fire at a market because he was upset about unemployment and how he was getting taken advantage of on buying his fruit. And make no mistake, obviously religious rife has been through the Middle East for thousands of years, but make no mistake, it is about economics. I give you an example. Had the opportunity to be one of the first Americans to visit President Morsi in Egypt. As you recall, President Mubarak had ruled the country for a long period of time. The Egyptian people had had enough with President Mubarak. He was an ally of the United States. He was an ally of the Israelis. But the Egyptian people determined at the time that the game was rigged, that somehow the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer, and that they decided to have enough with President Mubarak. And they went to the streets and they threw out President Mubarak and they put in President Morsi, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. I was sent to meet with President Morsi in Egypt. And it's interesting, I took 35 business leaders with me because they had to prove to the business leaders, these are people who are heads of Coca-Cola and Cisco and Google, I mean, huge corporations that had huge amounts of economic interest in what was going on in Egypt. They weren't just doing it because I picked up the phone to call them, I assure you. And I went to his office, and Morsi at that point is a Caltech grad, speaks perfect English. And I said to him, I was with our ambassador, Ann Patterson. I said, "Mr. President, I'm pleased to be here. Congratulations on your election. I have in the next room, in a room just like this, we have 35 CEOs of the biggest companies in America." And he looked at me and he said, "That's exactly who I want to talk to. Those are the people that I want to talk to. It's all about the economy." I said, "Well, maybe this guy gets it. This guy may be a real winner. I know he's got issues around the issues around Muslim Brotherhood. Maybe he understands what's going to drive the Egyptian people." So guess what happened? The economy didn't get better. The economy got worse. Unemployment didn't go up. The economy didn't go up and went down. Unemployment went up. And guess what happened to Mr. Morsi? Mr. Morsi was thrown overboard, and he was replaced by General Sisi, who's now the commander in Egypt. So when I say to you it's about the economy, it is about the economy. At the end of the day, Egyptian people are no different than Americans and no different than Europeans. They want food, they want jobs, they want petrol to go down. They want the same attributes that we all want. And as we think about these issues around the Middle East and what's happening in the Middle East, be it in Palestinian issues, be it in places like Tunisia and Libya, we must think about economics. So some people have asked me when we started on this, and Secretary Clinton was focused on this, and so is Secretary Clinton, about this idea of economic statecraft. So what do you do about it? That's a great idea. Great. We have bad, surely terrible economics here in the United States as well. What do we have to do? What should we be doing in the Middle East? And we pointed out to a handful of things. One is we need to recognize it as a problem, to recognize that it's not just about religious history. Two, we need to force and try to attempt to create a rule of law. No U.S. company and no European company and no company will invest in a country that's not rule of law. You have to have contracts. If you're going to sell goods to a country, you want to make sure you get paid. If you don't get paid, you want to go to a court. In many of these countries, they don't have that. And so if you're selling goods and services, you're not going to want to do business in a place that you can't actually get paid. You need job training skills. Hell, we need job training skills here as well, but they need it even more so. There is no skill set. You've got to be able to train your people. You need trade promotion, and you need micro-lending. You need to be able to provide money to small and medium-sized enterprises. We call them SMEs, little teeny companies that produce $10,000, $5,000, $3,000. That is how you drive a society and how you drive an economy. And we've got to use things like enterprise funds and OPEC. I just fundamentally believe in my heart of hearts that it's about the economy. My third observation, it's still a very dangerous place out there. You know, one of the things I learned, and I think Amy Klobuchar knows it well, and many of you who have been involved in public policy, you read about it in the papers, but you don't understand, I think, and some of us, and I certainly didn't understand until spending hundreds of hours sitting in the White House Situation Room, and how many people want to do us harm. And not to say that President Obama alone deserves credit, but I will argue that President Obama has done a very good job of keeping us safe. We can talk about the dismantling of al-Qaeda, we can talk about bin Laden, and we can talk about the use of technology. I can tell you something, we are better coordinated than we've ever been on our national security than we've ever been. I give George Bush credit, but I certainly give Barack Obama credit as well. The FBI, the Homeland Security, the Defense, the CIA, they're all working together in a coordinated way. I am not suggesting that it's foolproof. We live in a very dangerous place. I used to sit in those meetings and listen to the threats. Every month we'd have a meeting with the President of the United States and all of those agencies where they'd list off every single one of the threats towards the United States. And the cells that are out there and the people wanting to do us harm, make no mistake, this is the number one issue that we should be thinking about as a country. And as the debate has been raging around the NSA and the issues about the spine or the revolving issues around Snowden, I think we need to have an enormous amount of discussion and observation and debate, and that's why you have a United States Senate, that's why you have a Congress to discuss these issues. But make no mistake, it is imperative that we keep the tools that we have in place to keep us as safe as possible. And let me just say my final observation, and this is more of an editorial observation than none. As someone who has spent an enormous time between government and politics and government and Wall Street, you can get pretty cynical. I'm pretty cynical, right? You pick up the newspaper and you read about Obamacare website, or you pick up the newspaper and you see that we shut down the government, or you figure out that we can't get our act together on, getting some sort of budget to deal with our deficit, and you say, oh my God, all these people, what are they doing all day? And I understand that. But then you see people like Amy Klobuchar and Tim Penny and Mark Kennedy and the men and women that I spent time with in Afghanistan and Pakistan on the uniform, and quite frankly, the people who are spending 24/7 sitting in some windowless room trying to figure out the website for Obamacare, they're the men and women who I have an enormous respect for. They all say to me, oh, you're a business guy, tell us how we can do better. I'm like, are you kidding me? I said, I worked on Wall Street. I can't tell you how to do anything better. But what I can tell you, I can tell you what we can do. We can learn from you about how you do things and how you give back and how you're committed. So as we sit and we sometimes get very cynical, we should not lose sight of the men and women who serve this country every day to do the right things. So with that, thank you very much for having me.
We do have a couple microphones that'll be moving around the room. It's my job to simply facilitate this Q&A session. One question did come to mind as we think about the likelihood that Secretary Clinton will now be running for president. Would she likely tap you to work in some capacity on the campaign? And given your history with Spanis and Mondale, would that be wise on her part?
Wait, Warren, where are you sitting? Hey, Warren, I'm sorry about that. Okay, first of all, I have no idea what Secretary Clinton's going to end up doing. It's interesting, and I really didn't know Secretary Clinton very well when I took the job, interesting enough. I mean, I knew her in a Washington sort of way. I did fundraisers for her and all sorts of nonsense. She's the real deal. You know, she's the real deal. I mean, she's a great executive. You know what I mean by that? And only in the most positive way. She led not only the State Department, but she connects to people in a way that's, I think, is an imperative. And I think from my perspective is she gives a task, she empowers the people. Her view of this is that you can govern in a way if you enjoy the act of governing, and she does. And part of this is how she's been brought up. It's part of the fact that she's been a United States Senator, that she was First Lady, that she's been involved in the game of Washington. And this is my own personal view, and I may share for others. Listen, if she decides to run, and I have no idea if she would, there's no question, if you took a blank resume and just looked at it, if you were a job applicant, and you looked at a resume, you would say, I think this person is qualified to be president. Okay? I think most of us, even if you don't even like her, would have to say that to be the case. I think it's time to have a woman as President of the United States. And it's either Hillary or Amy, so we can decide as we go here. So, thank you.
One of our more recent speakers was former Ambassador Mark Green, and he talked extensively about the economic opportunity for American business investment in Africa. Given your remarks about it's the economy, stupid, not only here but abroad, maybe you could talk a little bit about that continent and beyond Egypt, some of the other opportunities that you would urge business leaders to consider?
Yeah, listen, I think we've been a little bit asleep at the switch as it relates to Africa. I think the United States has nowhere near as much as the Chinese have done. The fact of the matter is President Obama announced Power Africa, which was a big initiative on his last trip to Africa. The reality of this, the Chinese are there all over Africa. Those of you who've traveled, you'll see their focus on infrastructure, roads, buildings, big power generations through everywhere from Kenya to South Africa and everywhere in between. The reality is it's an emerging market, and it's a booming emerging market. Even a bank like ours and have done almost nothing in Africa. Banks like Citibank have done more. Some of the big international, HSBC in London, have actually spent more money and more resources. I fundamentally believe that's a huge opportunity for us as an emerging market. And I encourage all of you who either have big international footprints like Cargill and companies like that who are heavily invested in Africa already to focus this. This is a long-term investment, but at our peril, we won't be there. Listen, I think at the end of the day, the real investment opportunities are in the BRIC countries still. I mean, Brazil, Russia, India, China. Those countries are phenomenally growing. Listen, I think the Chinese with President Xi as the new leader, and as you see, did the third plenary session, which he just finished. He clearly understands the reforms that need to be put in place to drive economic growth. Their biggest concern is social unrest and economic growth. There's still an enormous market out there. India has been, in my view, the thing that has perplexed many of us, those of us who've been involved in the world of business for a long time. We have 1 billion English-speaking people. The reality of the economy is still growing, but until they get their hands around the issues around corruption and the issues around opening those markets, there's still huge amounts of opportunity there. But I think it is, there's lots of opportunity, and I fundamentally believe the economy is improving overseas. I think Europe is 15 months behind the United States. I think clearly the improvement of the economy is uneven. I wouldn't say necessarily it's a jobless recovery, but certainly it's not recovering as fast as many people need it to recover. But I think the opportunities here and opportunities in Europe are great. Our guys will say, men and women who work at Morgan Stanley, and our analysts will say the United States still is the best bet for investment. It's still the long-term best bet over the next 12 to 24 months. Followed quickly by Europe.
And we do have a question off this side of the room. Identify yourself quickly.
Hi, my name's Ron Garber. Could you look into your crystal ball and kind of share with us your thoughts about where you see the P5+1 Iranian nuclear negotiations and the American, Palestinian, Israeli negotiations? And not to be presumptuous about your answer or overly pessimistic, but what do you see happening if either of those fail to produce an agreement?
So for those of you who may not know it's kind of a little bit of a State Department lingo. It is the team of people who are working to solve the Iranian nuclear problem, and it's the United States and a bunch of our allies who are in the midst today negotiating with the Iranians to try to resolve what is arguably an enormous national security issue for us and for our ally being Israel and the Middle East in general. I'll make 2 points, one economic and one reality. The reason the Iranians are at the table right now are for one reason and one reason only, is we are crushing their economy. The sanctions that we put in place started with George Bush, dramatically increased by Barack Obama, thanks to a lot of efforts around the world, is basically crushing their economy and forcing them to the table, okay? And we can't lose sight of that. Now the question is, when you're in a negotiation, like we've all been in a negotiation, trying to get something, either you're selling your house, you're selling your car, and how far do you push before you say you're going to blow up the deal? That's where we are. We're at that level of negotiations right now. We need to start testing the theory, are the Iranians serious about having a long-term peaceful existence? That's a question for us. But for us not to test that theory is a mistake. That is not to suggest that our relationship and our support and our commitment to the State of Israel is unwavering. But the outcome of not doing something in Iran is an outcome none of us want, which is getting into a war with the Iranians. Okay, so I think I'm optimistic that this administration and Senator Klobuchar may have a different view, but I think she probably would agree. We're at the right place. We'll see what the final deal is. Whatever deal we can come up with the Iranians, it will be the first step in several steps to get the Iranians to do what we want to do vis-a-vis their nuclear capabilities.
I think we have a question on this side of the room as well.
Good afternoon, Alan Tomats. Do you believe that Wall Street has a disproportionately large influence in Washington?
Can I tag team that question?
Sure.
He's definitely going to answer that question, but I'd also like him to answer it in the context of his feelings about Dodd-Frank. And it's continuing to unfold. There are more regulations coming out. And how should we view that?
I'm not your normal Wall Street guy. So when I'm on my floor, I sit on the executive floor of Morgan Stanley. They put like a L for liberal on my door, and I was also the chairman of the industry, by the way. So I was the most popular person in the room when I talk about these issues. Listen, I think that Wall Street takes an enormous amount of responsibility for the economic crisis. Most of you'd say, oh, of course, but we do, and we should. And quite frankly, I am a big advocate for much of the rules that have been advocated on Dodd-Frank. The reality is, I think the industries are safer than they ever were. I think the idea that we have more capital, that we're forced to have more capital, I think is healthy for the industry, in my personal view. Not always shared by some of my colleagues, but I personally believe that to be the case. I believe there's businesses that we should get out of, that we kind of morphed into. That's okay, we can do that. And I think the reality of this is that a lot of mistakes were made in 2008 by a lot of people. A lot of people in this room, a lot of people who shouldn't have been in houses they couldn't afford, a lot of people who bought securities, a lot of blame goes along. But guess what? A lot of blame is heaped on Wall Street, and some of it, and a great preponderance, is probably acceptable. Okay? Do we have influence? I think the industry has plenty of influence. So does everyone have influence. I mean, the importance of Wall Street, which has been demonized, this is about, for those of you who have businesses, it's the ability to get credit. At the end of the day, it's about credit. And one of the lessons we learned in 2008, when I was sitting at my desk and thinking I was going to end up jumping out the window because I couldn't believe this was happening to me. I remember my wife calling me up and said, "You don't have all of our money at Morgan Stanley, do you?" I said, "Oh, no. I put most of it at Goldman Sachs." Okay? So let me be clear. I think it is but the lesson I learned during that period of time was very simple, which was when companies like GE were thinking that they couldn't finance themselves from Monday to Wednesday, that credit is what drives the economy, okay? And that we got to be focused on that. So I am a believer that these rules are important. Now, like anything else, the pendulum swings to one to another. And after the Enron crisis, you got Sarbanes-Oxley. For those of you who spent a lot of time like, oh my God, Sarbanes-Oxley is going to ruin our lives. Those of you who've got public companies, like everyone's going to run to Europe to register their companies because Sarbanes-Oxley. Guess what? Sarbanes-Oxley was a pain. It wasn't great, but we got through it. Are we any less or more competitive because we have Sarbanes-Oxley? I would argue with most of my friends we're probably okay. All right. So I think we have to be smart about these rules. We can't put us in a situation that we're not competitive to Europe and Asia, which have now mega banks. But I think we got to take it step by step. We need to get these rules. The one thing I will tell you that we got to finalize these rules. What drives companies like mine nuts is just basically that Monday they're talking about, Wednesday they're talking about, they're changing it on Thursday. You can't manage around that. I say it is if we could just get if we can solidify what we're doing with our ability to make money, we'll have the ability to make money for our shareholders and for our customers as long as we understand where the playing field is.
With that, I'm going to ask my colleague, Mark Kennedy, to come forward to help me present this whiz-bang paperweight to our guest speaker, and to ask all of you to help us thank him one more time.
The Economic Club of Minnesota's mission is to provide a world-class, nonpartisan forum for national and international leaders in business and public policy to discuss ideas that affect how Minnesota can better compete in the global economy. The Economic Club of Minnesota, engaging the world, strengthening Minnesota.